When Nigeria achieved independence from British colonial rule on the 1st of October 1960, the prospect appeared promising and the expectations for the future of the new country were high. Buoyed largely by the discovery of commercial quantities of petroleum in the south, the potential for economic growth was great. But by 1970, the stability of the country was greatly damaged by a decade of corruption, economic underdevelopment, regionalism, and military coups, culminating in a 2.5-year war that saw the deaths of over 2 million people. This project consists of 4 separate videos that look at the events that almost led to the destruction of Nigeria. In the first video, we'll look at how it all began. The British laid the borders of modern-day Nigeria in 1914 when the government, under Sir Frederick Lugard, amalgamated its Islamic Northern and Christianized Southern Protectorate to form a unified colonial state. Thereupon, the people within this border were known to the world as Nigerians, but in reality, this name meant little to most of the indigenous people whose lives continued to be primarily centered on local communities that existed for hundreds and thousands of years. The first 3 decades of the 20th century saw the establishment of the British colonial administration in Nigeria. Along with it came transformations to the Nigerian economy and societies. But while the colonial system brought some material benefits to the country, it also alienated and frustrated most Nigerians who felt exploited and believed that the government had eroded culture and tradition. In the early 1920s, some European-educated Nigerians began to push for greater control over their governance. At the forefront was this man, Sir Albert Macaulay, a civil engineer turned journalist who organized protests in Lagos and other parts of Nigeria, indicating a strong antagonism towards colonial rule. These events resulted in the Clifford Constitution of 1923, which allowed more Nigerians in a newly formed legislative council. The 1930s saw the emergence of a new generation of anti-colonial activists calling for a greater involvement of Nigerians in governance. Led by charismatic visionaries and dominated by the ever-growing class of European-educated Nigerians, this new nationalist movement placed increasing pressures on the colonial government for an end to colonial rule. With the highest concentration of Western-educated Nigerians at that time, Lagos, the colonial capital, was the nucleus of this movement. Before the 1930s, Macaulay and his Nigerian National Democratic Party had dominated the political spectrum in Lagos. But in the early 30s, this new generation of intellectuals would form an organization that would challenge Macaulay's control. This organization was known as the Lagos Youth Movement, which later became the Nigerian Youth Movement in 1934. It began as a body that demanded quality educations for Nigerians, but in the space of 4 years, it became the most powerful nationalist movement in the country. By 1938, the Nigerian Youth Movement had spread beyond Lagos to many parts of Nigeria, having a combined membership of over 10,000. In 1945, Nigerian workers struck for 37 days over the increase in the cost of living, shutting down postal, railway, and telegraph services around the country in the process. A new organization, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons (NCNC), was an active participant in the strike. The strike ended when the colonial government met the demands of the workers, but this new organization will become a force in the nationalist struggle for Nigeria unity and self-governance. Its leader, Nnamdi Azikiwe, was the most influential Nigerian nationalist that emerged in the 30s. His great sense of solidarity took him to the leadership of the Nigerian Youth Movement. But in 1941, Azikiwe would leave the Nigerian Youth Movement over a dispute concerning a legislative election he felt was marred by ethnic rivalry. He left along with a large percentage of members to confound the NCNC with Albert Macaulay. The years between 1945 and 1954 saw the introduction of 3 new constitutions in Nigeria. The first, known as the Richard's Constitution, revamped the Legislative Council and allowed Nigerians as the majority for the first time. Under the Constitution, Nigeria became a 3-region federal state, having houses of assemblies in each region and a central legislature based in Lagos. Although the Richard's Constitution intended to promote unity among Nigerians, it ended up intensifying regional identities. The NCNC, which started as a leading nationalist organization based on its pan-Nigerian motivations, soon became regionally inclined, becoming the single most influential body among the Igbos in the East. The Nigerian youth movement soon fell under the leadership of a wealthy Yoruba cocoa farmer called Chief Obafemi Awolowo. Under Awolowo, the NYM became the Action Group, a Yoruba-dominated organization in the West. Awolowo became the leading proponent of Yoruba nationalism, focusing his energies on gaining Yoruba support in the Western region. In the North, the major cultural organization was the Hausa Fulani-inclined Northern People's Congress, founded in 1943 by three of the few Northerners who had attained high-standard European education at that time. The NPC sought to promote Northern unity and maintain regional autonomy. However, under the leadership of one man, the NPC would ultimately become the most influential organization in the North. This man was Alhaji Sir Ahmadu Bello, the Sardauna of Sokoto. In 1950, Sir John Macpherson, the colonial governor after Richards, made revisions to the Richards Constitution. His constitution, known as the Macpherson Constitution, expanded the regional assemblies and made provisions for the first general elections in the country. As the general election approached, the NCNC, the Action Group, and the MPC became full-fledged political parties in their various regions. In 1951, a controversy ensued between the leaders of the three regions on the issue of centralizing the government. This led to the Lillington Constitution of 1954, which managed to forge a middle path between the desires of the three regions. The constitution set up the federal system of government, under which Nigeria gained independence in 1960. In 1957, Sir Alhaji Tafawa Balewa of the NPC became Nigeria's Prime Minister. The final election that would determine the country's first independent government was conducted in 1959. The NPC got the largest number of seats, and the majority government was created through an NPC-NCNC coalition, making the Action Group the major opposition party. Alhaji Tafawa Balewa maintained his position as Prime Minister, and Nnamdi Azikiwe of the NCNC took a largely ceremonial title as Nigeria's first indigenous Governor General. On October 1, 1960, Nigeria became a full-fledged sovereign state. However, the foundations upon which it gained independence were not firm. The NPC-NCNC coalition that governed at the federal level quickly became dominated by the NPC, which, under the leadership of the Federal Prime Minister and the Northern Premier, undertook measures to improve the conditions of Northerners within the Federation. They felt that the Northern region should have a chance to catch up with the South after suffering deliberate underdevelopment during the colonial era. They regularly handed out appointments and promotions to underqualified Northerners at the expense of more qualified Southerners. Nearly all funds earmarked for defense, health, education, and roads went to projects in the North. This infuriated the Southerners, especially the NCNC, who saw their skills disregarded by a federal system that increasingly seemed to value ethnicity over merit. In 1962, the Action Group of the Western region faced a crisis over its position as the opposition party. Some members believed that the party was becoming irrelevant at the national level and wanted to abandon their position as opposition party by becoming allies with the NPC. Among the adherents of this line of thought was Chief S.L. Akintola, who had succeeded Chief Awolowo as Premier of the Western region in 1959. Awolowo did not like this. He tried to have Akintola removed as Premier, replacing him with his ally, Chief Adegbenro. The result was a major parliamentary crisis between Awolowo and Akintola. At this point, Prime Minister Balewa, who hoped to align with Akintola and gain a foothold in the Western region, declared a state of emergency in the West and suspended the Action Group government for 6 months, replacing it with an interim government. Akintola was reinstated as Premier by the end of the 6 months, but the damage done on Awolowo's Action Group party would prove to be an irreversible one. In 1963, a new region was carved out of the West, further weakening the Action Group. Things will only go from bad to worse for the party because in the same year, Awolowo and several other leaders of the Action Group were imprisoned on charges of treason and corruption. The 1962 census presented an opportunity for the Southern parties to enroll the NPC's control of the National Assembly. The number of seats allocated to each region in the Federal Assembly was based on the regional population, and from 1953, Northerners having the highest population constituted the majority. The Southern governments realized that manipulating the figures would give them more seats in the Federal Assembly. When the figures were released, the Eastern and the Western region recorded an incredible 70% increase in population compared to a 30% increase in the North. Balewa refused to accept the results, and the following year, another census was conducted, and this time, it was the turn of the NPC to manipulate the results. 8 million new Northerners were miraculously discovered in 1 year. The NCNC bitterly opposed this result but failed to prevent it from becoming official. The new population of the country officially stood at about 55 million, of whom 29 million resided in the North. Having lost the fight to gain control of the Federal Assembly, the political parties in the South now turned their energies towards winning the upcoming elections of 1964. The NCNC and the Action Group united with minority parties in the North to form the United Progressive Grand Alliance (UPGA). Intending to maintain the status quo, the NPC also merged with Akintola's newly formed Nigerian National Democratic Party and a few fringe parties in the South to form the Nigerian National Alliance (NNA). The campaigns leading up to the 1964 elections were abominable. In the North, the NNA arrested many UPGA officials and prevented their supporters from campaigning. In the Western region, clashes between NNA and UPGA supporters often resulted in violence, claiming lives and properties in the process. The goal of the NNA was to prevent UPGA candidates from being nominated and stand for elections. In this way, they hoped to present many of their candidates as unopposed. Since the NNA officials controlled the election machineries in both the North and the West, they could easily hamper the nomination process for the UPGA candidates. Outraged by the intimidation they faced, UPGA officials called for a boycott of the election, but the boycott was a success only in the Eastern region. As a result, many seats in the Northern and the Western regions went unopposed to the NNA. After the election, Balewa called Azikiwe to create an NNA-led government, but Azikiwe refused. He later allowed it when Balewa agreed to incorporate more UPGA members in his government, reschedule the elections for the boycotted seats, and recontest the elections for the Western Regional Assembly the following year. The UPGA won most of the boycotted seats in the 1965 elections, but this was not enough to strengthen the majority claim of the NNA. In the end, the NNA won 198 of the 312 seats in the National Assembly. Although this was a clear victory, the conduct of the election had been disastrous, causing resentment amongst the UPGA supporters and causing many Nigerians to question the fairness of the country's democratic system. Nigerians' faith in their system of government, already weakened by the 1964 elections, was further strained by the Western Regional elections of October 1965. The election was a disaster. When the preliminary results were announced on October the 13th, Akintola and the NNDP claimed 51 seats to the UPGA's 11, with 30 seats still to be decided. Chief Adegbenro, the acting leader of the Action Group, immediately declared 68 victories for the UPGA and announced that he was forming an interim government. For this, Adegbenro and other leaders of the Action Group were arrested. Throughout November and December, UPGA supporters took to the streets to protest the election results. The riots were widespread, often resulting in clashes with the police. The Western region had turned into the Wild West. Rather than call a state of emergency in the Western region, Balewa decided to send the army to the West, but it still wasn't enough to stop the crisis. The Western region was out of control. Disgusted by the political mess the country was in after only 6 years of independence, a group of politically radical army officers took the bait. They decided that the only means out of the political deadlock was to execute a military revolution to overthrow the government. At the core was a group of young army officers in the rank of major. They planned to overthrow the government, release Chief Obafemi Awolowo from prison, and install him as president. In the early hours of January the 15th, 1966, they struck. Before Nigeria's independence, the colonial government embarked upon transferring the command of the Nigerian army from the British to the indigenous soldiers. This program, known as the Nigerianization exercise, saw the influx of many Nigerians into the military. In the end, the Nigerianization exercise unintentionally stratified the army on ethnic lines. At independence, the Igbos from the eastern region of southern Nigeria constituted 60% of the army's officer corps, while lower positions like the infantry soldiers and NCOs were largely occupied by the Northerners. One of the reasons for this was that the vast majority of Northerners were uneducated. As a result, they couldn't compete with the largely educated Southerners who quickly took up most of the highest positions in the army. Although the educational requirements were largely reduced to accommodate more Northern soldiers, the ethnic hierarchical structure of the army remained largely unchanged. With a civilian government dominated by Northerners and the army officer corps dominated by the Igbos, there was an ever-present risk of a future conflict if one day their interests diverged. The psychology of this relationship would later prove fatal. In 1965, Major General Johnson Agwe-Ironsi, a southerner from the eastern region, commanded the entire Nigerian army. At the time, the army had only 2 brigades and 5 battalions. The 1st and the largest brigade, located in the north, controlled the 3rd and the 5th battalions. It was commanded by Brigadier Samuel Ademulegun, a southerner from the western region. The 2nd Brigade, commanded by a formidable northern soldier, Brigadier Zechariah Mayamulari, was located in Lagos, the country's capital. It controlled the 1st, 2nd, and the 4th battalions in the south. During the crisis of the western region that saw the imprisonment of Chief Obafemi Awolowo, the leader of the major opposition party, and the creation of an alliance between the federal government and its rival, Chief Esel Akintola, some southern soldiers became deeply involved in politics. To make matters worse, the federal government ordered the 4th Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Agbogo Lajema, to suppress the volatile political unrest in the west. As a result, the officers, especially those from the south, became politicized. Southern officers were more likely to be politicized than their northern counterpart because the government which they saw as corrupt was largely controlled by the Northerners. They saw the trial and the imprisonment of Chief Obafemi Awolowo in particular as unjust. One of the Southern soldiers who served as an intelligence officer during the trial was Major Chukwuma Kaduna Nzegu. He quickly became obsessed with Awolowo's political ideology. This would lead him and some other officers to plan a revolution that would change the country forever. They planned to overthrow the government, release Chief Obafemi Awolowo from prison, and install him as president. Chief Obafemi Awolowo was, for example, to be released from jail immediately and to be made the executive provisional president of Nigeria. Contrary to popular beliefs, the idea for the coup did not originate with Major Nzegu. In fact, the original conspirators were the following majors: Emmanuel Ifejuna, Donatus Okafor, Christian Hanuforo, Humphrey Chukwuka, and Captain Ugbona Hoji. These men were based in Lagos and began to seek co-conspirators stationed in the north, east, and western regions. This led Major Anuforo to bring his childhood friend and former schoolmate Major Kaduna Nzegu into the plot. Nzegu was a chief instructor at the Nigerian Military Training College Kaduna in the northern region. He in turn brought his colleagues, Majors Adewale Ademoyega and Timothy Owantuegu, into the plot. All 3 had previously served as members of the 5th Battalion in Kano. Solving the unrest in the western region was one of the reasons for the revolution. But up to 2 days before the planned date, the majors had no officer to actualize the operations in Ibadan, the capital of the western region. All attempts to recruit officers from the 4th Battalion in Ibadan were unsuccessful. They instead had to rely on Captain Wobosi, the commanding officer of the 2nd Field Battery in Abeokuta, to travel to Ibadan and carry out the coup. He was also a former schoolmate of Majors Nzegu and Anuforo. The majors were also assisted by some junior officers and NCOs who simply obeyed orders to guard strategic locations without realizing that they were facilitating a military coup. Of all the culprits, Major Ademoyega was the only one that was not of the Igbo ethnicity. He was a Yoruba from the western region. Although the ethnic composition of the group may not have been deliberate, ethnic ties may have been unconsciously present to facilitate the plot's secrecy. The plotters had similar backgrounds. They were young, between the ages of 28 and 35, educated, arrogant, well-traveled, and fluent in Hausa, the major lingua franca of the northern region. Realizing that their superior officers were virtually certain to oppose the coup, the majors knew that they could not successfully execute the revolution unless those superior officers could somehow be neutralized. The plotters were divided into 4 main units. Major Ifejuna led the Lagos operations. His unit was the largest, comprising 22 soldiers. Their main targets were the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, the General Officer commanding the army, the Commanding Officer of the 2nd Brigade in Lagos, the Army Chief of Staff, the Commanding Officer of the 1st and the 4th Battalions who were in Lagos for a visit at the time, the Adjutant General of the Nigerian Army, and the Quartermaster General of the Nigerian Army. At the time, the President was overseas on a compulsory medical leave. He was also on the list. Majors Nzegu and Owatuegu led the operations in the northern region. Their main targets were the Premier of the Northern Region, the Commanding Officer of the 1st Brigade, and the Commanding Officer of the Nigerian Military Training College in Kaduna. Captain Wobosi was in charge of the operations in the west. Their major targets were the Premier of the Western Region and his deputy. The Western Region was the only region that had a deputy Premier. Lieutenant Colonel Jerome Ogochi led the operation on the Eastern Region. The Premier of the Eastern Region were their main targets. On the issue of eliminating the targets, the majors held divergent beliefs. We could not come into agreement on whether some people should be killed. This issue was therefore left to the judgment of the officers to use the situation on ground to determine whether to kill or not. For an operation as sensitive as this, the decision to take or spare the lives of their targets was left to the discretion of the individual soldiers. This decision would later prove to be unwise. In the north, the soldiers divided themselves into 3 groups. Major Nzegu headed the group that looked after the Sardauna. Another group led by Captain Ben Bule was to take control of the 1st Brigade headquarters and all radio and TV stations in Kaduna. Major Timothy Owatuegu was to lead the detachment of soldiers to the residence of Brigadier Ademolegu, the commanding officer of the 1st Brigade in Kaduna, and Colonel Ralph Shodiende, the commanding officer at the Nigerian Military Training College, who was also his immediate boss.
Major Nziogbu, can you please give me an account of the night of the coup in Kaduna?
Well, it's rather something like the longest day. We started this off on the night of the 13th of January when a night exercise was planned by the military college, which I command. We took our troops to the ground and taught them how to do night attacks. We didn't tell them what we were planning for, but at the end of the exercise we took them out and showed them various places where they were to stand and just remain in the vehicle. Next day we went out again for the same type of exercise, and at the end we issued them with ammunition this time, live ammunition, and told them that they were going back to the same place as they went yesterday, but this time they were to get certain people.
And they were with you, were they?
Oh, of course they did. Oh, they all supported us.
As a chief instructor at the Nigerian Military Training College, Nzegu could bring out troops at night time without arousing suspicion or giving the impression of unusual activities. He often took his men on a nighttime training exercise known as Exercise Damisa. His men were unaware that they were participating in an exercise for a military coup to overthrow the government. In the early hours of January 15, 1966, Nzegu turned Exercise Damisa into a full-blown coup. Major Nzegu, assisted by 3 northern sergeants, fired the Sardauna's residence with anti-tank guns. Nzegu found the Sardauna hiding with his wives and domestic staffs near his car park and shot him dead. Sarumi, the Sardauna's faithful bodyguard who came to defend him with a sword, was also shot dead. One of the Sardauna's wives, who refused to be separated from her husband and tried to shield him with her body, was also shot dead. The attack on the Sardauna Lodge raised the alarm connected to the house of his senior assistant secretary for security, Ahmed Ben Musa. Musa drove to the Sardauna Lodge to ascertain the cause of the alarm, but upon arrival, he was shot dead inside his car before he had a chance to disembark and investigate. Meanwhile, soldiers led by Major Onwuegwu made their way to Ademolegu's residence, subdued his guards, and went straight to the brigadier's bedroom. He was lying beside his wife. Onwuegwu opened the door and shot both of them dead. The death of Colonel Ralph Shodende, the commanding officer at the Nigerian Military Training College, remains unclear. Some accounts claim that he was likely killed by a grenade tossed at him by Major Onwuegwu. However, his wife, who was present when he was killed, testified that he was shot by several soldiers, including Majors Onwuegwu and Onwuegwu. While it is not clear whether Onwuegwu could have been involved in Shodende's death since he was at the Sardauna's residence at that time, the responsibility for the colonel's death certainly lies with Major Onwuegwu. Elsewhere, at some strategic locations, separate troops led by Captain Bengbule are taking control of the headquarters of the 2nd Brigade, the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation, and a telephone exchange in Kaduna. So far, the northern region seemed to have been entirely subdued. The mutinants now awaited the reports from their southern counterparts. In Lagos, on the night of the 14th of January 1966, many senior officers of the army attended the party in honor of Brigadier Mai Malari, the commanding officer of the 2nd Brigade. He was getting married for the second time after the death of his first wife. Also in attendance were some of the coup plotters in Lagos who felt that their absence will elicit suspicion. After the party, the plotters held a meeting at Major Ife Ojuna's house. The major acquainted the officers with their plans, and after which they were on the move, everyone on their separate mission. Getting to the Onikan roundabout, Major Ife Ojuna divided his troops into 3 units. The first, led by 2nd Lieutenant Godfrey Ezedibo, was charged with arresting the finance minister, Chief Festus Okotie Ebo, who was then the most corrupt politician in the history of the country. The 2nd unit, comprising 5 NCOs, was left behind to watch over the vehicles and ensure that no other vehicle entered or exited the roundabout during the operation. Major Ife Ojuna led the 3rd unit to the Prime Minister's residence. Between 2 and 3 a.m. on the 15th of January 1966, and some soldiers made their way to the Prime Minister's residence. The intruders overpowered the police officers on guard and forced the ADCs at gunpoint to lead them to the Prime Minister's living quarters. When the Prime Minister opened the bedroom door, he found Major Ife Ojuna brandishing a gun at him. Ife Ojuna saluted and informed him that he was under arrest. Allowed to say his prayers, Balewa was led out of the building wearing a white gown, white trousers, and slippers. By the time they reached the parked vehicles, Chief Okotie Ebo, the finance minister, had been arrested with his hands tied. The officers assisted Balewa into the back seat of Ife Ojuna's car and threw Okotie Ebo in the back of a 3-tonner truck. The convoy drove to the Federal Guards official mess, which was the rendezvous location for the Lagos plotters. Elsewhere, soldiers led by Major Ademoyega set up roadblocks and occupied strategic locations, including the control room of the police headquarters at the Lion Building and the Nigerian External Communication Building in Lagos. A group of soldiers, led by Major Don Okafor and Captain Orji, arrived at the home of Brigadier Mai Malari, the commander of the 2nd Brigade. Okafor tried to bluff his way past Mai Malari's guards by claiming that he had come to take over guards' duties from them, but the guards were not buying it. About the same time, another attack was taking place at the residence of the Adjutant General, Lieutenant Colonel James Palm. Major Humphrey Shukuka, his colleague at the army headquarters, led the attack. Palm placed a call to Mai Malari to report some shootings in his compound, but as soon as the brigadier picked up the receiver, he heard a burst of machine gun fire emanating from his residence. It was the sound of Okafor's men engaging his guards in a gunfight. He immediately dropped the receiver and ran out of the house into the road. Major Okafor's attempt to track him down were unsuccessful. At Palm's residence, the plotters had successfully overpowered his guards and went straight into his sitting room to arrest him in front of his pregnant wife. Lieutenant Colonel James Palm was taken alive to the officers' mess at the Federal Guards Barrack. Escaping from his abductors, Brigadier Mamilari hid in a bush close to his house and watched as Okafor's Land Rover sped up and down searching for him. He was trying to make his way to the Federal Guards Barrack, which would take him about 15 minutes on foot. All of a sudden, he came across the car of Major Ifeojuna, who was also en route to the Federal Guards Barrack with the captured Prime Minister. Recognizing his brigade major, Mamilari waved down the car but was promptly shot dead by Ifeojuna and Second Lieutenant Ezedigbo. The whole incident was witnessed by the Prime Minister, who was still in Ifeojuna's car at that time. Realizing that Lieutenant Colonels David Ejo and Agbogolajema, the commanding officers of the 1st and the 4th Battalions respectively, who were guests at Mamilari's wedding party, were lodging at the Ikoyi Hotel, the convoy of Major Ifeojuna and 2nd Lieutenant Ezedigbo decided to take a diversion. They made their way to the hotel and forced the desk clerk at gunpoint to inform Lajema that he had a phone call. When the officer emerged from his room to take the bogus phone call, he walked straight into an ambush. Ifeojuna and 2nd Lieutenant Ezedigbo emerged from their hiding place and shot him dead. They then made their way to the room of Lieutenant Colonel David Ejo, but they could not find him. When all attempts to locate him proved futile, they decided to return to the Federal Guards Barrack. Elsewhere, Colonel Kor Mohammed, the Army Chief of Staff, and Lieutenant Colonel Hunegbe, the Quartermaster General of the Nigerian Army, were shot dead in their homes by Major Anuforo. Hunegbe was the only Igbo kid during the coup. He was shot in the presence of his pregnant wife. Popular misconceptions claim that Hunegbe, due to his Igbo ethnicity, was not an initial target for the majors, and that he was killed because he refused to hand over the keys to the armory. However, at the time of the coup, Hunegbe was the Quartermaster General of the Nigerian Army. In the Army, the Quartermaster General is the officer responsible for the procurement of army supplies such as uniforms, boots, and helmets. Not being in command of a combat unit, Hunegbe had no access to the keys to the armory, and even if he did, his home would be a very hard place to obtain the keys, as soldiers are not in the habit of storing them in their homes. What is more probable is that Hunegbe was killed because he was known to be very close to Brigadier Mamilari and was not interested in the coup. Meanwhile, Major General Agwe Ironsi, the general officer commanding the Nigerian Army, was leading a sham life. After leaving Brigadier Mamilari's party, he left for another party at the Apapa Wharf. While he was attending the party, soldiers led by Major Don Okafor showed up at his house. Ironsi's guards became suspicious when Okafor explained that they had come to take over guard duties from them, the same pretext he used when he was trying to access Brigadier Mamilari's residence. And by the way, Okafor had now received the news that Brigadier Mamilari had been killed. In any case, Agwe Ironsi was nowhere to be found, and the plotters left the premises empty-handed. In Ibadan, the capital of the Western region, plotters led by Captain Emmanuel Wobosi, who had driven from Abeokuta to Ibadan, arrived at the residence of the Deputy Premier, Chief Remi Fani Kayode, and arrested him. Seeing that the plotters were now out of sight, Kayode's wife telephoned the Premier to inform him of what had happened. Akintola thus had prior notice of the impending arrival of the plotters and prepared himself. When they arrived, Wombosi stood in the middle of Akintola's courtyard and shouted at him to submit himself for arrest. Akintola did not comply, but instead he opened fire on the plotters with his shotgun, lightly wounding a few of them in the process. After putting up a stiff resistance, Akintola was overpowered and shot dead by Captain Wombosi. Captain Wombosi exhibited a puzzling mix of brutality and compassion during the coup. Shortly before killing Akintola, he had taken a detour from his assignment to help a pregnant woman who had gone into labor to get into a hospital. Overnight, Major Ifeojuna sent orders to the 1st Battalion in Enugu, asking them to deploy soldiers to take over key installations and arrest some top government officials in both the eastern and the midwestern region. For several hours, the officers in Enugu mulled over the strange but seemingly legitimate order. Finally, they took a position at the Enugu airport in the early hours of the morning. Soldiers under Captain Joseph Eyidigbo headed to Benin, the capital of the Midwest, and placed Chief Dennis Osadebe, the region's premier, under house arrest. Dr. Michael Okpara, the premier of the eastern region, was also arrested. Soldiers led by Lieutenant Uguchi ordered his arrest. At the Federal Guards official mess in Lagos, plotters under Majors Ifejuna, Ademoyega, Anuforo and Chukwuka met as prearranged, bringing along their captives, which included the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, Lieutenant Colonel James Palm, who were still alive, and the bodies of Colonel Kol Mohammed and Lieutenant Colonel Agbogola Jema. Anuforo scolded Chukwuka from bringing Lieutenant Colonel Palm to the mess alive, but Chukwuka argued that he had promised Palm's wife that her husband would not come to any harm. By now, most of the targets in Lagos were either dead or under arrest. The majors left the Federal Guards barracks on separate convoys, taking their captives along with them. On the way, Lieutenant Colonel James Palm was told to step out of the vehicle and shot dead by Major Chris Anuforo. When Agwe Ironsi returned from the second party, he received a telephone call from the Prime Minister's residence that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance had been kidnapped. Ironsi headed for the Federal Guards barrack and instructed his guards not to let anyone in. When he arrived, he put the Federal Guard soldiers on alert and told them to be battle ready, and instructed the regimental sergeant major in charge not to take orders from any officer other than him. When Major Okafor reappeared at the Federal Guards barrack, he discovered that his men refused to take orders from him. "I just spoke to my ROSM just now. He nearly shot me. He said the GOC had been to the barracks, and he commanded the troops not to take any orders from me, and none of them will obey me now. They were even ready to shoot me." Ironsi also went to the police headquarters in Lagos. Unbeknown to him, Major Ademoyega had been at the headquarters and departed only minutes earlier. Ironsi entered the lobby with his pistol and saw two soldiers posted there by Major Ademoyega. When the soldiers could not give him a satisfactory explanation as to what they were doing there, he ordered them to return to their barracks immediately. The GOC then proceeded to rout soldiers from the 2nd Battalion. On his way to the headquarters of the 2nd Battalion, he came across a checkpoint marked by plotters under Captain Hodji, but he managed to face down the men and continued his journey. The young officers at the checkpoint were intimidated by the presence of the G, and for the third time, Agwe Ironsi emerged unscathed from the clutches of the coup plotters. Arriving at the 2nd Battalion headquarters, the GOC gave orders for the arrest of Major Ifejuna and other of his co-conspirators. Armed with orders from the GOC, soldiers from the 2nd Battalion mobilized loyal troops to recapture certain key installations in Lagos. Realizing that the GOC was still in town and still alive and mobilizing troops for a counterattack, some of the plotters in Lagos began to flee. The ones brave enough to return found out that the troops they had posted to strategic locations had either been dismissed, arrested, or replaced with soldiers loyal to Ironsi. The GOC then ordered Lieutenant Colonel Ejo, the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, to return to Enugu and take charge of the situations there. Upon arrival, Ejo ordered the soldiers who had departed to various installations on Major Ifejuna's command to return to the barracks. He also ordered the arrest of the officer who relayed Ifejuna's orders to the battalion. Later that day, Captain Yedibo's unit that traveled to Benin returned to base in Enugu on the orders of Ejo. And with that, Ejo had successfully crushed the coup in the eastern and the midwestern region. Though Major Nzegu was in control of Kaduna and most of the north, he wasn't in control of the entire north. Lieutenant Colonel Ojukwu, the commanding officer of the 5th Battalion in Kano, refused to cooperate with the major. On the morning of the coup, Ojukwu had received a telegram informing him that the coup was in place. Seeing this, he quickly locked the armory and sent his keys to a relative in Kano for safekeeping before he dared to share the news with his men. When Nzegu asked him to release funds for his soldiers to be paid, he refused. Nzegu then sent Captain Ude, one of his aides, to Kano, but when he arrived, Ojukwu arrested him. Meanwhile, Majors Ademoyega and Anuforo were still on the loose, seeking ways to get past the loyal troops guarding the key areas around Lagos. They decided to head towards Abeokuta, but before they could do so, they needed to get rid of the bodies of Palm and Kol Mohammed, which were still in their possession. The finance minister was also with them and still alive. When they got to a nearby bush, they alighted from their cars and dropped the bodies. Chief Festus Okotihebo was then asked to step out of the car into the bush, where he was shot dead by Major Anuforo. When the majors arrived at Abeokuta, they went straight to the 2nd Wreckage Squadron. On getting there, they found out that they had been betrayed by their friend Major Obiano, the commanding officer in charge of the squadron. Obiano had turned his men against the plotters and joined with the troops loyal to Agwe Ironsi. For fear of getting caught or losing their lives, Ademoyega and Anuforo went into hiding. Elsewhere, it was now becoming clear to Major Ifejuna and his men that a coup in Lagos had failed. And since the GOC was still alive, mobilizing troops on every side, the major felt no point keeping the Prime Minister alive. The convoy came to a halt close to a bush on the Lagos-Abeokuta road. Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, Nigeria's first Prime Minister, was told to step out of the car into the bush. Major Ifejuna brought out his gun and shot him. The Prime Minister fell on the foot of a tree close by, dead. After crushing the coup in most parts of the country, except in the north, Ironsi was advised by his officers to take power. They argued that this was the only way they could stabilize the country and prevent further bloodshed. The next day, Ironsi held a meeting with the Council of Ministers, after which they agreed to surrender power to the armed forces. The Council of Ministers meeting on the 16th of January 1966 have asked us to convey to you their unanimous decision to transfer voluntarily the government to the armed forces of the Republic, and to wish the success of the armed forces in bringing about peace and stability in Nigeria, and that the welfare of the people shall be their paramount task.
My main concern is to restore law and order as soon as possible.
On Sunday evening, most of the plotters in the south were still on the loose, and Major Nzegu was still in control of the northern region. Agwe Ironsi had managed to subdue his colleagues in the south, leaving him with two choices: either to face Ironsi head-on, which he was likely to lose as the bulk of the army would obey the GOC's orders rather than his, or accept defeat. Ironsi had demanded he be brought down to Lagos, dead or alive. Before long, Major Nzegu found himself isolated, confused, and feeling betrayed, and he decided to negotiate with the GOC.
Now, what are your relations with General Ironsi in Lagos?
Well, very good. He's my boss. I have always been under him, and I still am under him. There isn't really any problem. A few misunderstandings arose, but this was due to the publication in the press and by announcements over the radio. At one time, they started calling us in Kaduna rebels, whereas in fact the revolution was all a planned affair all over the country.
On January 17, 1966, after a few days of negotiations, Major Nzegu appeared before the joint press and handed over the control of the northern region to the new military government. On the 19th of January 1966, Major Shukuma Kaduna Nzegu was arrested. Subsequently, most of his conspirators were also arrested. Major Ademoyega and Onwontuegu returned to their place of work as if nothing had happened. They managed to stay free for a few weeks until their role in the coup was revealed. Thereupon, they were arrested. Major Ifejuna fled to Ghana and was received by President Kwame Nkrumah. He later unwisely returned to Nigeria. Upon arrival, he was swiftly arrested. And with the arrest of Major Nzegu and his co-conspirators, the coup had been successfully crushed. Nigerians welcomed the new military government with massive outpouring of jubilations and goodwill. Newspapers around the country opened with headlines celebrating the overthrow of the government. As well as becoming the head of state, Agwe Ironsi was elevated from the Army's GOC to Supreme Commander of the Nigerian Armed Forces and was now in overall command of the Army, Air Force, Navy, and the police. After coming to power in January 1966, he immediately appointed military governors in each of the country's 4 regions. The new military government abolished the posts of Prime Minister and President and formed a new Supreme Military Council. The council replaced the parliament as Nigeria's highest legislative organ. Also, a new cabinet known as the Federal Executive Council replaced the Council of Ministers in the previous regime. The new regime declared itself a corrective government and began to detain politicians from the previous government, except those from the north. In May 1966, Agui Ironsi issued what might be considered as one of the most controversial decrees in the country's history, the Unification Decree. The decree unified the previously separate civil service of each region. Previously, the civil service had been regionalized, with each region having control of its civil services. Northerners did not like this. They feared that unifying the civil service would expose them to competition from the better educated Southerners, especially the Igbos, who could easily replace them. Northern reaction to the decree was swift and violent. In the same month, Northern mobs took to the streets and protested. Many Igbos living in the north were attacked and murdered. And suddenly, Northerners began to see the coup as an Igbo plot to dominate the entire country. Soon, this ideology would spread to the northern soldiers who had lost some of their brothers and friends to the coup. They now felt the need to avenge the death of their northern colleagues murdered in January. Agui Ironsi's inclusion of some of these northern soldiers in his private security team would ultimately seal his fate. On the 28th of July 1966, barely 6 months into the new regime, a northern soldier by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Mohammed would mastermind one of the bloodiest coups in Africa's history to remove Major General Agui Ironsi from power. This coup will be famously known as the July Remarch. Although Nigeria's first military coup succeeded in replacing the political leaders and creating the first military regime, the underlying issues of corruption and regionalism that the coup intended to solve